well met. I am your humble narrator Amanda, here to share tales of daring do and daring don't, in the hopes of amusing, entertaining, and perhaps even educating. And all I ask in return is that you stay a while and listen. These are source books. These are basically role-playing Bibles. This is the Star Wars source book, obviously, and this is the Rebel Alliance source book, and this is the Imperial source book. These are source books. And source books are pretty awesome. I got these from my friend Rob. They're pretty awesome. They give you basically everything you need to run a game. Except they don't quite. Because quite often you're going to run into situations, because players are at the same time both genius and stupid, you're going to have a couple of rules that are not in the book to take into account the sheer insanity that are players. And that's what I actually want to talk about, is house rules. So house rules are literally a rule created by a GM for a particular adventure or for a particular setting that is specific to the games that he runs. And some of them can be really simple. The most simple one is one that I have, which is, unless you have your hand in the air, the last thing you said is what your character does. So, for example, I think this is the way it happens. It happened. My friend Joseph was over. He was popping his role-playing cherry. He had never played a role-playing game before. So I ran essentially a Ravenloft adventure in Greyhawk. Anybody who's played AD&D and knows the settings will know that that's kind of a bit screwy. But Greyhawk is essentially the world that AD&D started in, that Dungeons & Dragons started in, essentially. It's not quite that, but yeah. Ravenloft is basically the realm of Dracula. And I'm a big fan of plane hopping. I'm a big fan of, to really give someone something that they can't predict and that they have to either wing it or they have to really plan ahead for, is to have people go through multiple dimensions. So like, you pass through a door and suddenly you are in hell. Yes, you are in hell. You are in Dal Éireann, the very nexus of hell on earth. What do you do? I'm also a big fan of door puzzles and mirror puzzles and things like that, but that's secondary. So I had explained right at the beginning of the adventure that house rule number 1 was, if you want to say something out of character, put your hand up. So he said, they basically passed through the door and they fell out of the sky into what turned out to be a very large lake of, well, urine. Yes, I was taking the piss. And they get out of it and they come across this ginormous individual who has 4 arms, is butt naked, has slimy skin, and is very, 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 how do I put this? Obviously male. Let's just say dude's member was hanging to his knee. And Joe was joking, but I wasn't joking about the house rule. And he goes, I stab him in the dick. So I was like, okay, roll for attack. And he goes, what? I said, you said it. Your hand wasn't in the air. Roll. He stabs him in the dick and everything goes to hell in a handbasket. But that's a house rule. And I have that house rule because it actually makes the first time a player screws up with it is usually the last time. Because they're aware of it and they're nervous of it after the first time. It's great because it actually keeps out of game conversations to a minimum. Yeah, you have to mess, you have to joke with the other players, you have to have a bit of fun in that respect. But you're there to play a game. Play the game. And if you really want to say something, put your hand up and say it. Or stand and say it. And different groups I've played in have had different rules for this. Some of them have what they call, I think it's called a speaking stick, where you actually put your hand on the stick, and that shows that you're speaking as a player, not as a character. It's a good example of one. I have a few basic house rules that I run with. That's number one. Number two is I assume your character is smart enough not to stand out in the rain butt-ass naked. What do I mean by that? I mean, I assume your character is smart enough to pack food. I assume your character is smart enough to pack water or the means of getting water. I assume your character is smart enough to carry basic survival equipment. Now, I do mean basic. I mean a few days food, maybe 3 days food, maybe 2 days water, a means of starting fire, a means of carrying fire. And it's not even primitive cultures, even going back to the Middle Ages, it would not have been uncommon for people to have, especially people who traveled a lot, to have a means to carry fire with them. Whether it was a hollowed log that you would pack with a very, very slow burning material that you would put a single coal into, mostly seal up, and it very slowly burns down. Carrying fire is essential to survival, so it makes sense. In a fantasy setting, it's not as important because, I mean, you have things that are called cantrips, which magic users use. We'll get to those in the future. And one of them is, like, in a fantasy setting, an AD&D setting, you have one which is basically burn. It creates a mote of fire. And the longer it stays available as long as you concentrate on it. It's a way to start a fire. But I assume your characters are smart enough to go, I'm going to probably need to eat. So I'm not going to have you spending half of a gaming session working out the inventory of your party, unless you want to. I assume you're smart enough to carry your basic personal weapon. Where I will go into logistics is, how are you going to transfer this stuff? How are you going to carry it? Are you going to have horses? That you do need to figure out. So that's two of my basic house rules. Put your hand up. I assume you're smart enough to bring food. Because you're not meant to be a dumbass. That's two of them. Another basic one, and it's a surprisingly basic one that most people don't realize it shouldn't be a thing, is I assume you innately have local knowledge. What do I mean by local knowledge? Most people have a pretty good idea of what is available to them in a 50-mile radius around them. Now, depending on the time period and the setting, I might expand and contract that to maybe 20 miles or 30 miles or 40 miles, but you will have a vague idea of what's out there. You'll know that in that direction is a town, in that direction is a river, in that direction is a lake, in that direction is the Tower of the Dark Lord Imhotep, who sacrifices virgins once a year to his dark mistress. You know, you'll have basic local knowledge. So the way I get around that is I usually have like a very brief summary of what's in the area and what your character would know. You create your character, but it's a pretty good pretty good bet that everyone will know that, oh, there's a ruined tower outside of the town, or where the nearest well is in every direction out of the town. Stuff like that. These are the kinds of things that you would expect to be kind of standard, and often they're not, which kind of surprises me. Now, say in the Star Wars setting, well, you have access to databases and what have you, so if you need to know something, you don't necessarily need to have a character have local knowledge. You can simply have them, like, I don't know, pass some kind of tech test to see if they can find information in a database or on a computer system or things like that are important. I also have another basic house rule, which is actually it's less about gaming and it's more about keeping players happy. And that is this: all food at the table is communal, unless stated otherwise. Why I say unless stated otherwise is you might have someone who has a who has a dietary allergy or a dietary intolerance, which means that they can't eat certain. They might they might not be able to eat anything else at the table except for what they brought. You leave that alone. But everything else is communal food, unless someone says, "Guys, I brought this for myself. I hope you don't mind. I just really need comfort food," or this is actually the only thing I'm eating all day, or it's. I have seen player groups break up because someone took a freaking jelly bean. I'm not even kidding. A jelly bean. A game that I played in for 2 years broke up about 4 sessions before the end because somebody took a jelly bean. Finally, I have a 4th house rule. And my 4th house rule is this, and I have said it in a previous video. Story trumps all. What does that mean? That means, within reason, I might fudge a dice roll if it's going to make for a better story. I won't tell the players I'm fudging it. And that's really important. The players don't know if it's a legitimate or a fudged dice roll. That keeps them on their toes. But say you have a barbarian and there's a great ravening beast below him from a cliff, and the barbarian goes, "I charge off the cliff, I hold my sword like this, and whack!" He passes his roll, but the ravening beast manages a crit to avoid. He hears him roar and vroom. Except, depending on the game, that might make for a better story where the barbarian misses and now he's on the ground, he's injured because he didn't have a softer landing, and he's on his own until the party get down, fending off this beast while on low health, probably with at least one broken bone, possibly with a broken weapon. Depending on the setting, that might make for a better story. On the other hand, depending on the setting, I might want the setting and the characters and the story. I might want to fudge it so that the barbarian, so the beast doesn't quite avoid the barbarian. Barbarian the barbarian misses the thrust, but manages to catch himself on the body of the beast, which means he's injured far less. The beast takes a certain amount of damage, and now they're on an even footing. Story trumps all. As a GM, I feel it's my job to create a canvas for the players to create their great story. Tabletop role-playing for me is almost like communal novel writing. You're writing a story as a community. That includes a GM. And sometimes the best story is the one where the entire party are wiped out by the very first enemy they meet. Sometimes sometimes the best story is the guy who rolls an impossible character, which means that his character actually dies the instant the game starts. His powers or his abilities, they conflict and they actually kill him. Sometimes that is the best story. But sometimes the best story is a party of 3 standing up against a horde of raiders or bandits or Imperials and almost winning, or actually winning, and then having to face off against Vader. They're not going to win against Vader. At best, they're going to survive. But that's a great story. So do you want them to survive, or at least barely survive, the fight with all these Imperials, and then have to face off against Vader? Is that a better story? Or is it a better story that the Imperials eventually wear them down and crush them, and it ends with Vader sweeping in and standing over the dead corpses of the party and saying nothing, just stare at them, looks at them disdainfully, behind the mask, and then just turns around and walks off. End of story. Story trumps all. But the GM has the duty and the very difficult task of figuring out what the better story is. That's the hardest house rule, and that is the house rule that I struggle with the most in every game, because story trumps all, but how do you figure out what the best story is going to be? Anyway, this has been my short conversation on house rules. I'm sure we will revisit them at some point in the future. I hope you enjoyed this. I'll be back again next week with even more Stay a While and Listen, when you will get another opportunity to stay a while and listen. I hope you have a great week. Be good, and bye for now.